Welcome back, and welcome too to the first of our election battleground debates. Tonight and on Monday and Tuesday, the leaders of all three main parties will be here to answer questions from a panel of voters specially selected for us by Harris Research. Neil Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party, is our guest this evening. To stop Mrs Thatcher getting another overall majority, Mr Kinnock or his alliance opponents, or both, need to prize about 70 seats away from the Conservatives, compared with the 1983 result. And it's voters from three of these key marginals who form our audience tonight. 15 voters from each of the constituencies were chosen by Harris. They include supporters of all three main parties, as well as uncommitted voters, to make as demographically representative a cross-section as possible. The three constituencies concerned are the three so-called battleground constituencies targeted by Channel 4 News and featuring in our coverage so far. Dudley West is on the fringe of the Black Country. The Conservatives are defending an 8,500 majority over Labour, and it's just the sort of West Midlands seat Mr Kinnock must win if he hopes for power. The constituency is split both socially and politically. The area around Brierley Hill is a traditional industrial region, badly hit by recession. In contrast, over to the west lie richer, middle-class, more traditionally Tory pastures, with vast new housing estates in between. These estates represent the battleground within the battleground. Cheltenham, over in the southwest, is a struggle between the Tories and the Alliance. A prosperous little town where the elegance and architecture have long been a tourist draw, Cheltenham has always been high on the list of Liberal targets. The Conservatives had a majority of 5,500 last time round. Since then, though, the local political map has been coloured by the protracted row about banning unions from GCHQ, the secretive government monitoring centre, many of whose employees live in the constituency. Finally, there's Calder Valley on the borders of Lancashire and Yorkshire, and including a cluster of small towns along the River Calder. It's a big constituency with many miles of moorland, and the polls show that Labour has probably its highest hopes of our three battleground seats. Nearly 60% of the jobs are in manufacturing industry. Engineering works are steadily taking over where wool and textiles once stood proud. This seat offers some prospects for all three parties. So that's our election battleground, and our specially selected panel has come down to a central London studio from those constituencies, and they've joined us here to question Mr Kinnock. So, without further ado, let's take our first question to Neil Kinnock from Lynn Jones. She comes from Dudley West, and she's a waitress staff trainer.
Good evening, Mr Kinnock. What would be Labour's solution to the north-south divide? We feel like the poor relations in the Midlands, where once we were the thriving Black Country.
Thanks very much. It is true, as you suggest, that whereas we used to think of the north as Cumberland, Northumberland, Yorkshire, Lancashire, now that north-south line has slipped down to incorporate much of the West Midlands, and that's a measure of the movement of manufacturing industry, the loss of jobs, and the rundown, especially in the cities in recent years. What we are going to do about it is not try to resolve those divisions that actually go much beyond that neat line and spread into the southeast, obviously. Not try to pull any areas down, but to try and bring areas up. And the way to do it is to target the resources that we're allocating for jobs, for the improvement of the health service, for construction programs, both in terms of housing building and housing renovations, as well as the more general environmental improvements, on the areas that have the greatest need. Now, manifestly, the areas of highest unemployment or greatest urban decay have the greatest need, but in order to get an absolute assurance that the money is well spent, it'll be necessary for local authorities and other public agencies in those areas to come forward with plans, feasible plans, costed plans as quickly as possible. And those who come first from those areas of greatest need are the ones that most immediately will attract the attention. What we get as a consequence is the raising of standards in terms of generating employment, improvement of the environment, of buildings, of the health service and education in those areas. And at the same time, of course, they're not only generating jobs, they're improving the industrial infrastructure and making a contribution to improving the investment base of the economy. That's the only way to do it. I don't think that trying to squeeze the southeast and then reallocate resources is the way to do it. That means that you transfer the depression. Thing to do, identify the need and target resources at that need so that we get a speedy response and try and make those improvements.
Does that answer satisfy you?
Yeah, it does in a way, but I wondered if we would ever become sort of a well manufactured area again. You know, the manufacturing has all sort of seemed to disappear and shops and that have taken its place.
Yes, I think we can do it because, again, as you imply in your questions, while service industries are welcome and indeed they're a measure of a certain kind of prosperity, they're never going to be able to generate the jobs or the external trade that we need to make our living in the world. And the Association of British Chambers of Commerce, for instance, has said the service expansion is great, but they just can't make up the gap in earnings, in trade, in sales, so we've got to have manufacturing. I think that we can have modern manufacturing, but it's going to require the commitment of resources to new equipment, to the application of science and technology to our manufacturing processes, much more than we do now, and also, of course, to training for skills. That's got implications for the education program, as well as post-school training for young people and for adults. We've got those commitments in those areas. Most important thing is the flow of reasonably priced, durable investment, which we haven't had in this country. They've had it in Japan, they've had it in the Federal Republic of West Germany, France, the Nordic countries, and so on. We've got to do the same thing. So we are setting up the British Industrial Investment Bank specifically to provide the kind of investment resources needed by business of various kinds in order to get a modern manufacturing development. Because the West Midlands, together, for instance, with other areas that have got a base of skills, because the West Midlands has got that residue of skills and adaptability that's been shown over many decades, that's obviously going to be one of the areas in which we can stage the modern manufacturing revival.
I'd like to stay with the economy and ask for a question from Pauline Homer from Dudley West, who's a playgroup leader supervisor.
Good evening, Mr Kinnock.
Good evening.
Your solution to unemployment is to increase borrowing in order to buy jobs. This has been done by yourselves, the Labour Party, in the past. Whilst it works in the short term, it increases inflation dramatically, making our country less competitive, whereby the labour force is cut back yet again, increasing unemployment, which is then left in the Tories' lap. Why should it be any different this time?
First of all, if I can say that that portion of our policy that depends upon borrowing depends on a very small amount of borrowing, around about £3 billion, which comes to something less than 2% of our gross national product. Now, if borrowing were the source of inflation, the Japanese economy would be the most inflated economy in the world, and indeed the only economy rivaling it for inflation would be the United States economy, because they are the biggest borrowing economies. Why do they borrow? Because they use money for the reason that money should be used. It is to invest in such a way as to generate a return and income, wealth, that is greater than the cost of the borrowing. Now, in everybody's domestic life, as well as in the life of every community and every company, borrowing is undertaken in order to invest in the enhancement of production, the improvement of standard of living. And as long as that borrowing never gets to the point where the repayments on the borrowing are greater than what's derived in income from using that borrowing, then that's fine. And what we've seen in recent years is, yes, a cutback in government borrowing, but a doubling of private borrowing in Britain, so that we're more indebted as a nation, as households, than we've ever been. Much better to take on that very small addition to borrowing, and it is a minuscule fraction of our gross national product, use it not just to buy jobs, but to strengthen the manufacturing base, to improve the industrial infrastructure, as I said, with construction and training, and see that those assets are used in order to make our economy more efficient, more competitive, and sell in the world. Last point is this. When you talk about less competitive, the borrowing of the last Labour government was not by international standards very big, but what it did was to have an economy that had a manufactured trade surplus of £5 billion, that had 1.25 million people unemployed, that actually generated more wealth, had 20% more manufacturing investment, a 15% greater share of world trade, was more competitive, in other words, and even measured by productivity comparisons. What we've now got is lower borrowing, 15% loss of world trade share, 20% loss of manufacturing investment, and a loss of 30% of our domestic market, we've got less borrowing, but we've got a much less competitive economy. We've got to use that money to make our economy fit for the future, better equipped, more competitive.
I'd like to bring in Mr Russell Hopkins from Calderdale, who's taken early retirement, but is now self-employed.
Will you kindly explain, Mr Kinnock, how your policies will retain overseas investment, contain inflation, and at the same time protect the value of our savings?
Yes, certainly. First of all, the inflow of overseas investment has, in proportionate terms, always been higher under Labour governments than under Conservative governments, mainly because of the climate created for investment, either investment grants or relatively lower and stable interest rates, which mean that that inward investment can produce a better result. For instance, those who bring their factories in, whether Japanese or German or the Swiss or the French, and settle them, sometimes in greenfield sites, sometimes in taking over existing plant, have flourished. And that success story has encouraged further success. There's no reason to think at all that there would be any inhibition to that inward flow. But secondly, we'll be introducing what we call our capital repatriation scheme. As you may know, up until about 1979, under all governments, financial institutions had about 5 to 7% of their portfolios invested abroad. And that was manageable, that was okay. But since Mrs. Thatcher removed capital controls, which were first installed by Winston Churchill, removed those capital controls, the proportion of those portfolios has gone up to 17%. And we've had a net outflow of about £70,000 million in investment capital over the last 8 years. Now, we need that money in order to invest in the strength of our economy. And what we've therefore done is to say, where an institution has more than 5% of its portfolio, we're not going to stop overseas investment, more than 5% of its portfolio abroad, it loses its tax concessions in Britain. Where it has less than 5%, it keeps its tax concessions. Now, the independent analysts who've looked at this scheme all say that will attract and retain capital to a much greater extent than ever been the case before. That's just the one point, but you wanted to come in.
Well, are you happy with the answer so far?
So far on that one, but I am concerned about savings, and I'm also concerned about inflation.
Yes, quite. Well, if we can put them together, because they amount to the same thing, the inflation impact on the value of your savings. And clearly, if you are retired or semi-retired, you've got a particular interest in that. The worst estimate that we've had about the impact in inflation terms of our policies has been that they would go up. This is an independent analyst, not Labour Party. It would go up to between 6.5% and 7% for a short period and then fall back. That's not my words, that's their words.
That's almost double.
Yes, well, let's put it like this. In 1985, inflation under Mrs. Thatcher went up to 7%, if you recall, and then fell back. At that time, there were 3.3 million people unemployed. The same analysts say that if that inflation under our program goes up to 6.5% to 7%, we will then have an unemployment rate of 1.7 million unemployed. We will have very severely cut unemployment. Now, nobody wants inflation, but it's essential to get growth moving in the economy and to try our best to mitigate that inflationary impact. I think the best way to do it is by the improvement of production and the increase in production. In other words, to take a whole chapter out of the story of our successful competitors, who, yes, they do borrow, but they trade and they gain an increasing share of trade. They have less unemployment than we have, and they have lower inflation than we have. And the way they've done that is by enhancing both the quality and the quantity of their production and their sales. That's the way, as I'm sure you know if you're in business, that's the way to ensure that the costs of production are restrained in terms of final costs. That's the most effective way to combat inflation. No. Mrs. Thatcher hasn't been very successful in that respect. We've now actually got an inflation rate that is relative to comparable economies, and therefore, in trading terms, very bad news, relatively worse than it was in 1979 when she went into office.
I'd like to move on, because we have a limited amount of time at our disposal, and bring in Mr Stephen Jukes of Dudley West, who's a British telecom engineer.
Good evening, Mr Kinnock.
Hello, Mr Jukes.
Why does the Labour Party feel it necessary to repeal the recent trade union legislation covering secondary picketing?
Because it is in the nature of a democracy to permit free trade unionism, properly conducted, to be able to pursue a trade dispute. And it is sometimes necessary, though infrequently used, it is sometimes necessary to try and bring influence to bear on those who trade with the company or concern or have a relationship with the company or concern that might be involved in this dispute. Now, it was introduced by a Liberal government, accepted by Liberal, Conservative and Labour governments for 80 years. And it's only the onset of this government that has changed the law. It hasn't stopped secondary picketing. It didn't stop mass picketing. And the action taken against, for instance, the National Union Mine Workers, was taken not under Mrs. Thatcher's laws, but under the common law, which has existed, as you know, for centuries, and will continue to exist, and won't be affected in any way by the proposals that we've got. Meanwhile, where picketing or any other form of industrial activity results in violence, naturally, the full panoply of the other laws of the land, not trade union laws, they've got nothing to do with it, will apply in order to counteract and prevent violence if it should arise.
Would you like to come back on that?
Well, only to say that I think many people are worried about the influence the trade union movement would have on a future Labour government. And having this repeal in your manifesto does nothing to allay anybody's fears whatsoever.
Yes, I think it's important, first of all, to distinguish between what we're actually going to do and both the contemporary and historic background against which we do it, and the way in which our policies and our relationship with the trade unions are very luridly portrayed by sections of the press in this country. Now, I'm not whinging about that. I know the kind of country in which we live and the kind of press we've got, and they have fixtures in the firmament, so there's no good wasting energy on that. But I think it's important to recognize that the allegations about trade union influence on the Labour Party and Labour government have been made since time immemorial. But that's contradicted, isn't it, by the fact that in government, neither do the trade unions expect to exercise disproportionate or unjustifiable or unwarranted influence, and Labour governments don't allow it in any case. That certainly will continue to be the relationship. There is no vested interest that will rule over or have undue influence over the government that I lead.
Does that worry anyone else? Anyone from Cheltenham worried about the role of the unions if Labour came to power? Gentleman there.
When you repeal and actually reform the industrial laws, won't it in fact be the case that if employers still then want to bring action against secondary picketing, they will still be able to do so because the law does exist already, in fact. Yeah. The two things are not really the same.
That's right. Employers could always have so done if they could prove that it was in distraint of trade and not in appropriate pursuit of a trade dispute. That's always been the case. That was always the law. And there's a bit of a song and dance about the Tory laws in that respect, because it didn't change the law all that much. Meanwhile, as you suggest, we're not just removing that body of laws passed under Mrs. Thatcher, we are actually replacing it with an altogether more comprehensive set of laws with a dual objective, which industrial relations law should have. One is to do the best that is possible under the law, and the law isn't actually the determinant, but to do the best possible to promote good industrial relations with an emphasis on conciliation and arbitration, opportunities for representation, both inside the firm and in terms of the conduct of trade unionism. The other purpose is to guarantee the individual rights of trade union members. We do that by treating, as always has been the case, the constitution of a trade union as a contract in common law between the individual member and the union. And we say that if the union member has a dispute with the union, we will set up an industrial relations tribunal to which the member can go without all the fuss and expense of going to the county court in order to get redress of grievances. If not satisfied there, of course he can go or she can go to the county court, but it means that there's an extra means of guaranteeing the bottom line of individual trade union members' rights, which as an active trade unionist is what I want.
Now, I'd like to move on again. I'm sure there'll be other questions on that topic, but again, let's change topic and go to Mr. Philip Lowry of Calder Valley, who's a pool attendant.
Yeah, good evening. Mr. Kinnock, if we have a non-nuclear defence, do you really think we could stop a conventional type attack from Soviet forces?
Certainly, yes, because first of all, we've got very high quality forces. I think the best armed forces in the world, not the biggest, but the best. And secondly, we will be using all of the resources saved from Trident, by not purchasing Trident, and from Polaris, by stopping Polaris, in order to ensure that we can discharge our main naval role, the safeguarding of the North Atlantic approaches, by having a 50-ship surface fleet, that we can ensure that our Air Force is properly equipped. You may have seen the recent reports in which it's under-invested, and ensuring that we have the standards of supply and training and weaponry necessary for our army on the Central Front in West Germany. Now, the whole point of an effective conventional status and readiness is that if there is tension, if there is that contest or conflict, then it is controlled and prevented, stopped at the earliest, lowest possible level in order that there can be a reconsideration on both sides. That now, currently, of course, is part of NATO's strategy to try and stop it at that stage in any case. And it's one that we want enhanced.
You happy with that?
Well, we hear that they have so many more tanks and men and equipment than ours. Do you think we could bring ours up to that level?
Well, the independent, there's two ways of getting the parity in conventional forces. It is certainly the case that the Warsaw Pact numerically has a superiority. There's some doubts about two things, actually. The dependability of, say, the Polish army, the Hungarian army, the Romanian army, and there's a lot of doubt about that. Secondly, some of their weaponry isn't at the status of ours. Some of it is very good stuff. That's the one point. The second thing is, of course, the superiority of the properly prepared defender against the attacker. That's classic throughout military history, and it still exists now. But the important point is, if we are looking for conventional force balance, which is the intelligent thing to do, it's better, and President Reagan has acknowledged it now, together with many of the others, not so much to build up the forces of one side, but to get the reduction in the force of the other side. And already, even before the intermediate nuclear force talks are concluded in Geneva, the subject of conventional force reductions by the Warsaw Pact is on the agenda. In fact, there's been some very small reductions, but Gorbachev has volunteered more. Now, what we can do is bring it down and then possibly even discuss a parallel reduction. But let's get the Warsaw Pact forces down to that level, acknowledged and validated first, and then the discussions can go on after that. I think, too, it's worth saying, just as one last point, a lot of the independent analysts, like the Independent Institute of ISIS, Strategic Studies Institute, which is the world-respected institute, suggest that the actual superiority of the Warsaw Pact is not 3-to-1 or 2-to-1, but 1.3-to-1. Now, it may or may not be correct. We can certainly measure parity when it's achieved, and it's parity that's got to be achieved.
Now, Mr. Adrian Longville of Dudley West, who's an assistant credit manager, turf accountants.
Mr Kinnock, it has been stated in the national press that under no circumstances would the Labour Party form a coalition with the Alliance. Surely, in the event of a hung parliament, such a coalition would be advantageous to you in opposing the Tory party in Parliament and preventing them putting through measures that you strongly oppose.
Thanks very much. The coalition, if I accept the hypothesis of a hung Parliament, which I don't actually, I don't think we're going to have a hung Parliament, I think we're going to win. But let's accept it, because I know it's a question in a lot of people's minds, and it deserves answering. A coalition is unnecessary. In the system of the Constitution we've got and the Parliament that we've got, for as long as a government can maintain a majority and not be defeated in a confidence vote in the Commons, then it remains the government. And consequently, therefore, the choice is not for the main party in having to do a deal with minority parties, not necessarily the SDP and the Liberals, incidentally. It could be any one of a number of other parties, and we've got a fair galaxy now in the British Parliament. Not having to do, the pressure isn't on them. The pressure is on the minority parties in making their decision. Are they going to vote against a deliberate policy of fighting unemployment? Are they going to vote against the necessary raising of the old age pension?
So
Are they going to,
in a nutshell, what does it come down to?
We don't need any form of deals or coalitions. It's they've got to decide whether they're going to support those progressive policies. If they won't, then they're going to have to face the electorate and explain why they went in for that act of destruction.
Let me just pose this hypothetical question to the audience, and let's have a show of hands on it. If there were a hung parliament, how many of you would expect Mr Kinnock to do a deal with the Alliance? And how many, under no circumstances, would expect him to do that?
Can we check it through again? Because there's two meanings to expect.
Well,
right?
how many...
That could be an assessment of my character. Right?
No. All right, I take the point.
Let's do want and don't, you know.
How many of you would, in the interest of getting Mrs Thatcher out, expect the Labour Party to do its duty and do a deal with the Alliance?
Peter, you're not going to write my script again.
I think we've got a majority of coalitionists here. Isn't that the public mood?
Listen, the point is, there's a majority of the people, very clear majority of the people of Britain, who don't want another term for Mrs Thatcher. That's clear. And that's why the choice has got to be made next Thursday about how best, apart from all the positive reasons for voting for parties, how best that continuation, that on, is prevented. And what I've said very clearly for a very long time, in I hope terms that everybody can comprehend, is that whilst it is possible to tweak the nose of Toryism to cause damage to the odd Tory MP by voting in diverse directions in particular constituencies, it's only going to be possible to displace Mrs Thatcher's government by voting Labour across the country.
Right, and let's move on. With Mrs Anne Ayrton of Cheltenham, who's a clerical officer in the social services.
Good evening, Mr Kinnock.
Oh, couldn't see your lips move. It's a bit like watching David Owen sitting behind David Steele. Sorry, I shouldn't say things like that. Sorry, I'm terribly sorry.
As a Christian and a staunch Labour supporter, I was distressed to read that you and your wife have rejected your early Christian upbringing and are now atheists. Is this correct? And if so, do you not feel that you may have lost yourself quite a few votes?
No, I don't think that it is the case. First of all, we didn't reject a Christian upbringing. We had doubts, both of us, and tried to rationalize those doubts. But there is a leap of faith that I'd quite like to make, but I can't make. And it's a question that I've debated myself and many friends, many of them Christians, since I was about 17, 18. And the leap of faith is the belief in eternal life. And you'll be familiar with Christians who've got the same doubt, but feel able, despite the doubt, to make themselves committed Christians. Now, I think it better, in my relationships with other people, but also for my own peace of mind, not to pretend to myself that I am what I am not. And consequently, therefore, what my view is, I wouldn't speak on behalf of Glenys, she has her own mind, but I do know the case, that she couldn't be regarded as an atheist, neither could I. We're not even sure enough to be agnostics, tell you the truth. It's that kind of feeling, and a lot of people have this kind of feeling. Much better, therefore, to be straight about it and say, no, we're not practicing Christians, because we can't feel that it would be a genuine act of faith on our behalf, and we couldn't recommend it to others. Obviously, the values that are built in, the basic lessons and guidances of the Christian value is something we accept and try our best to practice.
Now, what's your answer to that?
Well, I'm pleased with your answer, actually, because you've said that you're not an atheist, and that is, and not even an agnostic. And I just feel that it's important that the standards, the Christian standards, are upheld, particularly by our, hopefully, Prime Minister.
Yes, I think that's important. This is a guess about which book. I think it's Matthew 25. Inasmuch as he do it unto the least of these, my brethren, he do it unto me. And I think that as a guide for moral values, attitudes, actions, and practical delivery to meet the needs of people, there hasn't been a better definition. And if I've got a nostrum, if I've got a guide, I think that would be it.
Now, I'd like to take a last question from Kay Bowden.
Oh, Mr Kinnock, if Labour wins this election, what do you intend to do about the terrorists in Northern Ireland?
Very briefly, Mr Kinnock.
Fight them with everything that we've got. And wherever they are, whatever excuse they use, fight them with everything we've got.
Then why do so many of your colleagues in London at different periods over the last few years entertain some of the terrorists in London?
I've never been able to accept the view that they hold, that there can be a distinction between the provisional Sinn Féin and Sinn Féin. I've never been able to accept as an individual that they are not taking the risk, unconsciously taking the risk of appearing to give some form of comfort to those people. I know the reason why they do it, because they really do believe that it is possible to build a bridge of understanding and hopefully undermine violence in that way. I've frequently discussed it on that basis. Actually, I think that tactically and in principle, in any case, they're wrong. It's not what I do. Because of this reason, in the United Kingdom and in the Republic of Ireland, both democracies, there is no possibility of legitimizing violence, whether it's the sole resort of any political group or whether it's the hypocritical mixture of violence and voting that's offered by Sinn Féin. I can't accept it. The government won't act on that basis. We'll build upon the Anglo-Irish agreement, and we will very firmly exert every possible power against the operations of terrorism from whatever source in our country. In addition, I think it's necessary too to step up international coordination and cooperation against terrorism, because in the mixture of zealotries that make up modern terrorism, there's such interchangeability and mobility, there's got to be international coordinated action against them.
And that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for. Thank you, Neil Kinnock, and thank you to our panel of electors. The next guest on our battleground debates is the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. That'll be in Channel 4 News on Monday, so join us again then. But for now, back to Nicholas Owen in the ITN studio.